Halo 2's development was brutal in all forms, and this affected the story of Halo 2 massively, as Bungie had to do lots of cuts to its story, so much so that the original story, while of course similar to the story that we got, has a lot of massive differences with it. And in this video, I want to cover the original story of Halo 2, the original intended vision, which luckily for the most part has been spoken about from various developers from Bungie, and we also have tons of storyboards that showcase the mostly final original story they wanted to use. Before obviously the brutal development kicked in and tons of cuts and compromises had to be made. So in this video, in honor of Halo 2's 20th anniversary, let's cover the original Halo 2 story that has been lost to time. Now, as a quick side note, like many development periods in video games, while we do have the original story, the story was always in a state of flux and ever changing, so the story may not just be like the previous version, but still I want to give the overall consistent original story that makes sense, with all the little technical nonsense. So with that being said, let's uncover this dusty tomb and get into the unknown of Halo 2's original lost story. So to cover the original story, I'm going to cover it in separate acts. This version of the story starts out pretty similar to the final game, with the Arbiter standing trial in High Charity after the events of Halo Combat Evolved. After this, similar to the final game, we see Chief on Cairo Station gain his upgraded Spartan armor, and this section is mostly the same, but with little small tweaks according to the storyboards. Like how the mongoose was originally supposed to appear in this level at some point in the game. After this, events pretty much proceed similar to the final game, but obviously with some of the storyboards, you have some designs of characters and things are different, and sometimes events just happen slightly different, but just nothing hugely to mention. In this version of Halo 2, Miranda actually has a grudge against the Master Chief, who she actually makes a disrespectful comment towards in the award scene in the final game as we know it. After this, the story pretty much proceeds similar to the final game, but then the next major difference actually happens to Chief, who actually similar to the Exo 2 trailer we saw in 2002, he actually jumps out of the airlock and lands onto a Covenant ship, showing the cancelled Covenant ship level that we were supposed to get in this original story. It would have had Chief land in space on the ship during the battle, but this time around without the bomb. Chief would enter the Covenant ship and fight their waves of enemies, which I'm sure would have been more of an extension to introduce the players to the new gameplay and vehicles. At some point in the level, Chief would have actually linked up with ODSTs and Miranda, who would have been on the ship as well, and this level would have been mainly as an introduction to her character in the story. In this level, reportedly, she would have had a grudge against Chief as we saw in the beginning of the game, and basically we would find out that she actually blames him for her father's death, with an overall arc in the game forgiving Chief at the end of this story. At some point in this lost level, Chief would have had a fight with an enemy called the Dreadnought, which was a lost enemy from Halo 2, then eventually would have stolen a Wraith and destroyed the ship by blowing up its power core with the Wraith's cannon and mortar. Even though some early versions of this level do mention that Chief would have also blown up the core by a Scarab, but it's kind of unclear whether it was supposed to be a Scarab or a Wraith. After this, the ship would start collapsing and Chief would escape the ship, similar to the final game with the Pelican. Next up, the events happen similar to the final game, and back on Earth with the design of the city, I'm assuming more closer to the E3 demo side of things. The next major change is actually more dialogue between Miranda and Admiral Hood on the Armorclad talking about Chief's goals and his ambitions. The next major change is actually the ending of the Earth section of Halo 2, when essentially the Covenant cruiser is trying to slip space and get out of there. This time around, the slip space actually happens during a massive space battle between Covenant's forces and the UNSC forces above the Earth, instead of the slip space explosion we saw in the city of New Mombasa on Earth. After this, other changes include some scenes with brutes taunting the Arbiter that were left out of the final game. And we also this time around have more extended talks between the Prophet of Truth and Arbiter in the jail cell, instead of a giant room for the Arbiters, which was the alternate setting for this scene originally. After this, the narrative continues similar to the final game. The Arbiter and the Shipmaster go to find the heretics, but this time around they're actually not in a giant station on a gas giant, but on a moon that would have the ruins of Alpha Halo from Halo Combat Evolved, and this would have been indeed a massive level that was cut from the final game. This massive cut level was eventually called Alpha Moon, but like we all know, it was cut and changed later on. Some assets of this level were reused later on, like in the mission we got on Threshold and also other parts of the campaign. The next major change is the conversation between the heretic leader and the Arbiter, which in this original version actually makes a lot more sense than the final game. Essentially in this original version, right when the heretic leader is about to tell Arbiter the truth about the Covenant, in the final game, he just randomly shoots at you for really no reason. But in this version, 343 Guilty Spartans arc actually shows up and explains more to the duo, but then Tartarus randomly shows up and kills the heretic and takes 343 to the hierarchs, interrupting any kind of conversation or revelations made to the Arbiter. This scene overall I really like more. It makes more sense and just works better in the overall story and explains more. I wish it was actually made it to the final game. Now for Act 2 of this original story of Halo 2. Events continue similar to the final game. On Delta Halo, the Arbiter would have tried to get the index of the Halo from Chief, Miranda, and Johnson, but have ultimately failed to do so. And then also the three human duo, which would have been Chief, Miranda, and Johnson, would have escaped in a Pelican during this whole situation. They would eventually crash land further away on Delta Halo, and they would eventually try to get some radio contact, while at the same time the Arbiter would try to reach them to get the index as well. Eventually the Arbiter would reach the humans, and also Tartarus as well. Then, out of nowhere, a giant Flood Hulk or Adrenal would have attacked, distracting the forces and the brutes as well. Then the Arbiter, the Chief, and the Flood Hulk would fall down a giant shaft, with it eventually killing the Hulk in the fall. After this, we get some major differences to the final game. Chief would actually this time around go into the bowels of Delta Halo, where you get to explore all the ruins underneath, killing Flug along the way, while also being teased by the grave mine. At some point you would have had some kind of Forerunner tank as well, all leading up to the cutscene where Chief and the Arbiter are captured and eventually have to talk to the Flood grave mine. This whole section of the game was actually a cut level called Forerunner Tank. It was actually eventually though massively cut down and replaced by a cutscene that we got in the final game. And also rumorly, there was supposed to be at some point Miranda would have strapped a bomb to Chief, but at some point the two of them would have resolved their differences. I'm not really clear if this was supposed to be in the Forerunner tank or at some point in the original story, but this is where all the rumors suggest it might have been. After this, the narrative pretty much continues similar to the final game until there's actually an extended moment in this original version of the story that would have actually had the scene where the prophets were talking to the Arbiter before sending him off the Delta Halo on High Charity. In this extended scene, we actually see more of the turmoil in the Covenant, where the brutes basically taking the mantle of the Honor Guard and also showing more of the Elite's reaction to it. During this extended scene, the prophets would have talked to the Arbiter and basically explained how the Covenant was formed, showcasing the history of them in 7 stone tablets. Mentioning how in the beginning, the prophets and the elites fought each other, but soon formed a covenant, with other races soon joining the covenant as well, basically with the goal to find 7 rumored rings in the universe, and also other objects that they would believe would send them on the great journey. Overall, I think that this cutscene kind of should have been kept in the original game, as it would have added more backstory to the covenant, and I think it would have been nice to give more additional information to the player. But at the same time, I could see the reasons why Bungie wanted to cut it, as the cutscene we got in the final game does pretty much the similar purpose, but with less dialogue and less time wasted. After this, we have events pretty much proceed similar to the final game. We actually have the scene where Gravemind is talking to the Arbiter and eventually leads to the whole big betrayal that we actually get to see in the final game, but overall slightly different in events. According to cut cinematics for the game and also in the behind the scenes for the game as well, we were supposed to be seeing an original cutscene where Johnson gets kidnapped with Miranda as well by Tartarus, but we also would have seen an extended fight with the Arbiter and brutes that would have been more intense and hands-on, really showing more hands-on element to the combat that we really haven't even really seen in the Halo game overall. But the scene was obviously shortened to the cutscene we got in the final game. Overall, I think it's a pretty neat moment and kind of wish it was left in. After this, the story pretty much proceeds similar to the final game. Chief gets the High Charity, but this time around some order of the levels are basically switched, as this time around the High Charity level happens later on instead of the Arbiter level that would happen later on after this level. For major differences in the High Charity section of the original story, this would have included a Warthog run for Chief trying to get to the Forerunner ship, and well, this part of the level actually got cut. Luckily though, modders have been able to restore it so you can technically play it. After this, in the scene where Truth leaves Mercy behind to basically get on the Forerunner ship, this time around it has a much more radically different design. Overall, the design is definitely more hinting at something more human related. Hint, hint. Shortly after the interaction with Mercy and Chief would have actually leaped on the Forerunner ship, attempting to take Mercy with him, but eventually dropping to his death after Chief lost his grip. We would have also had a more heart-touching moment of Chief leaving Cortana behind on High Charity, and eventually the ship heading to the Ark, or the Earth so to speak, really heading to the more major difference to this original story compared to the final game that we got. Now for the third act. This part of the original Halo 2 story is really where it deviates from the final game, as this whole act of the original story got cut due to the brutal crunch and development of the original game. Regardless though, let's get into this original lost ending of Halo 2. Following up from events from the final game, we would have actually seen the final fight between Arbiter and Tartarus, which would have happened similar to the final game, and of course the end goal would have been that Tartarus would have been defeated and they stopped the firing of Delta Halo. But this time around in this original story, it just would have been done in a much more confusing way, and then we would have been cutting to the High Charity section. After this, we cut the Chief on the Forerunner ship heading to Earth, basically trying to get to the Ark, which this time around the major difference is it's actually on Earth. Chief then near Earth would have actually jumped out, and this would have been the introduction to the final Earth Ark levels of the game. On Earth near the Ark, there would have been a massive battle going on between the Marines and the Brutes taking place. Chief would land near a squad of Marines and basically would encourage them to charge forward in the battle and give them a lot of cool motivation and some badass speeches. After a battle between Covenant forces, which I'm assuming mostly would have been in gameplay, Chief would eventually reach the Ark, with the design basically looking like the portal that we saw in Halo 3. After this, before entering the Ark, Chief and the Marines would find a lot more Brutes blocking the entrance, but luckily a massive thing would eventually turn the tide. A fleet of Covenant ships from above would basically glass the entire army of Brutes while Chief is taking cover with a group of Marines, which honestly is just an insane moment. Then the Ark would have started to activate its shields in terms of protection. Miranda and Arbiter and Johnson in the meantime would arrive in Phantoms on Earth and basically would help the attack on Truth and basically try to slip into the Ark using a trench run of some sorts and some kind of vehicle section of cut gameplay. Chief then would have entered the Ark, but this time around would have actually fought a lot of honor guards and also a lot of Covenant forces, I'm assuming in a lot of gameplay sections, but eventually would reach the Arbiter, who at this point was also confronting Truth, who was about to fire all of the Halo rings in connection to the Ark. Eventually though, the Arbiter stops him. This time around, after a brief discussion between Truth and Arbiter, instead of an energy sword stab that we saw in the final game, in this version he just simply would shoot Truth and then eventually snap his neck. Chief then would deactivate the Ark by shutting down all the firing sequences for the rings. After this, the sudden cancellation of the firing sequence would actually cause the pillars around the ring to basically shoot a big blast of energy to the other rings, officially shutting down all the firing sequences, which in this original version would have only been 5 Halo rings, but in later versions, as it seems in early cutscenes, it actually would have been changed to 7 later on in development. After this, with the sudden cancellation of the firing sequences, the Ark would start to collapse, causing Chief, 343, who was also there at the time, Arbiter to basically escape the Ark. During the collapse, Chief would hold back some Brutes and honor guards, while Arbiter would basically chase after 343, who rushes to the Ark's data vault. Now, in this section of the ending, I'm assuming there might have been 2 endings, or these 2 sort of endings of the story would have been maybe interweaved together like we see similar to the beginning of the game, but like I said, it's kind of unclear with this original version. But you'll see what I mean. Regardless, let's get into it. Later on, Chief would actually rush out of the Ark while it's falling apart and many close calls, and eventually we would cut to a celebration ceremony congratulating Chief for all of his efforts. And with a big shock to everyone, we actually get to see Chief without his armor and full uniform for the first time in the Halo franchise at this point. We would then see Hood decorating Chief with medals and also congratulating him for all of his efforts. Then after this, we would see some kind of celebration of humanity with Bungie's words, "0G fireworks" involved as well. Shortly after this, Chief would have talked to Miranda, hinting at a possible romance between the two and also saying that the war is officially over. Overall, it's kind of a weird scene, especially when you're looking at these two in retrospect. And this is all going on while they're looking at the elites leaving Earth and going back to their homeworld, officially ending the human side of Halo 2's original story. Now for the Covenant side of things. After this, the Arbiter would have found 343 in the data vault at the Ark while it was collapsing. 343 would eventually explain to the Arbiter that the vault holds all genetic life that the Forerunners wanted to preserve after the Halo rings firing. He also reveals that the Forerunners have left traces of their own race behind as well in the vault, and as the Ark is falling apart, an ancient Forerunner tomb is opened, and then Arbiter finds out the epic truth. A human skeleton was in the tomb, basically bombshelling and revealing that the Forerunners were actually humans from a long time ago. 343 would explain that the skeleton was in reference for future humans to grow and expand, as that was always the Maker's final goal, and also this was one of their few traces they left behind of their species. Overall, a pretty massive twist of the universe as a whole. After this, 343 and the Arbiter would have escaped the collapsing Ark, and eventually we get a similar celebration scene where we actually see the Arbiter congratulated by his fellow elites. Shortly after this, the Arbiter would have then spoken with Shipmaster and talks about going back to their homeworld to prevent civil war and also expand upon the elite race. Overall, this scene would have ended the Covenant side of things in Halo 2 and was basically very similar to the scene that we got in Halo 3. Now you may think think that this was actually ending the original Halo 2 story, but that's actually not the case, as even in this original story there was actually still a post-credit scene. This scene, similar to the final game, would have also involved Cortana stuck on High Charity with the grave mine that we saw in the final game, maybe hinting that even though Bungie wanted Halo 2 to be the final Halo in a sense, they still wanted to leave a few narrative elements open for a possible Halo 3 even if they wanted to come back to the franchise. And overall, that was the original story of Halo 2, how the story was originally supposed to be. Now for my overall thoughts on the original story of Halo 2. Overall, I can definitely say it's definitely an alternate version of the story that we got in the final game. Even though I do think aspects in this version are better than the Halo 2 that we got, overall, I still prefer the original game in some aspects overall. I think that the element of Miranda having a grudge against Chief is interesting, but it kind of doesn't work in the overall narrative and is not nearly developed enough to make it really interesting to the overall story. Other alternate scenes in this original version of the story I also kind of like as well. Like, I like the idea of the heretics being on the moon with the remnants of Alpha Halo being a more interesting level instead of the gas giant we got in the final game. And also having Tartarus killing the leader is just overall makes way more sense in that awkward cutscene that we got in the final game. Also, some of the cut levels in this original story, like the Covenant ship level, would have been super cool to see when it was fully realized. And also that Forerunner tank mission, while it did seem like filler, still seemed super cool and it would have expanded upon the huge universe of Halo. And hey, that Flood Hulk would have been awesome to fight. And then probably the most biggest shame of them all is that we never got to see the original ending of Halo 2 and the whole third act that was cut from the final game and all of the arc levels that would have been evolved. While I do think that the arc being on Earth is a super interesting idea and definitely fits more on the narrative level, I ultimately prefer the idea of the arc being this huge installation of the middle of the universe as just being more mysterious and cooler. Still though, I do think the design of the arc still looks great and they just basically copy and pasted it for the portal in Halo 3, so overall, no complaints from me. I also think in this original ending, how Arbiter kills Truth, I think is a bit too much. I mean, shooting a dude and snapping his neck just seems a bit excessive. Overall, I think that the Halo 3 version just did it a bit better. Now for my thoughts on the biggest twist of them all, which was the revelation that the humans were Forerunner this entire time. I personally prefer this twist and I think it would have been way better than the one we got in Halo 4. I think it just adds way more depth to the universe and a lot more intrigue. It's kind of like double bombshells to the Arbiter and the Covenant as a whole. Like learning the fact that his whole religion was a lie, but also to find out that their gods were actually the enemies that they were killing for years. It's just a truly insane thing to find out. It also opens so much potential narrative to be explored, like how did the humans build the rings and what eventually led to their destruction and what eventually went to the demise and the destruction of the Forerunner race. Just so many questions that could have been answered and explored. And while I don't hate the official canon we got now with the Forerunners being another species, I think that the original Bungie twist is just way better and more creative as a whole. It's a shame that we never got to see Bungie fully go into this idea in future games or never realized this original version of Halo 2. I also think that some of the expanded fight scenes, like that awesome moment in the finale where the elites glassed an entire army of brutes, was actually an amazing sequence. I do think though how it's interesting that, like I said, in this original version there was a post-credit scene, so who knows, maybe if this game got made there would have been an extremely alternate version of Halo 3 that we could have got. I also think that the double celebration moments that we see in this original ending of the game are also pretty satisfying. I mean, it's kind of crazy we get to see Chief without his armor actually done in a proper way, unlike Halo 4. Overall, I think that this original story of Halo 2, while not perfect, I do think has some pros over the final version, but also has some cons as well. I think for one, it has that great twist at the end, but also has some cons like that whole Miranda subplot, which I still think didn't really need to be in this original version. Overall though, I still think even in this original form of the story, it's still fantastic, and obviously a lot of cuts had to be made due to the brutal development, but even in the final game, the story that we actually got is still fantastic, and I really have no complaints with it. Still though, that was the original lost story of Halo 2. It's a fascinating story of what if this was actually the version that we got. This could have very well been the finale of the Halo series, or it could have been spawning a very different Halo 3, or like I said before, it could have been the end of all the Halos. We just never know. Still, it's a fascinating scenario and a cool deep dive into a pretty forgotten subject. And overall, it's kind of a shame that we never got to see it, mainly due to the circumstances involved and just the crazy development of Halo 2. Still though, that was the original lost story of Halo 2. Well, that pretty much wraps it up for this video. If you like it, please subscribe, and overall, hopefully y'all have a good day. Peace.